Good evening in India and good morning to in the United States and some other parts of the world. Good afternoon as well. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for the first day of the 3-day World University Summit hosted by OP Jindal Global University. We are now entering into the second keynote address of the day on the theme post-COVID global realities, less than meets the eye. We have with us two distinguished scholars. I have great pleasure in welcoming Professor Dr. Philip Altbach, who will be delivering the keynote address. Professor Altbach is a research professor and founding director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, where from 1994 to 2015, he was the Monash University professor. He was the 2004 to 2006 Distinguished Scholar Leader for the New Century Scholars Initiative of the Fulbright Program, was given the Holohan Award for Distinguished Contributions to International Education by NAFSA, Association of International Educations, the Bowen Distinguished Career Award by the Association of the Study of Higher Education, and has been a senior associate of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. In 2010, he was erudite scholar of the government of Kerala. He has taught at Harvard University, the University of Wisconsin, and the State University of New York at Buffalo. He has been a great friend of India, somebody who has very keenly observed the evolution of Indian higher education and some of the more recent challenges that Indian higher education has faced. So thank you very much, Philip, for joining us to deliver the keynote address. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Professor Dr. Stephen P. Marks, who is a François-Xavier Bagnoud Professor of Health and Human Rights and Director of the Program on Human Rights and Development at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The emphasis of Professor Marks' work is on public health and human rights, drawing on the disciplines of international law, international politics, international organizations, and international economics. Professor Marks' recent research has focused on the right to health, global health governance, integrating human rights into sustainable human development, mental health, poverty, tobacco control, and the right to development. He has published many books, articles, and book chapters in each of these areas. His earlier work has dealt with biotechnology and human rights, impunity for mass atrocities, terrorism and human rights, cultural rights, access to medicines, and human rights education. Of course, it's also important to mention that Professor Marks has been closely working in India as part of OP Jindal Global University and Jindal Global Law School in many aspects of visiting capacities, and he has had the opportunity to understand and contribute to the development of Indian higher education institutions. With those words, I am going to now invite Professor Philip Altbach to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, Philip.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be speaking at this conference and also to be speaking to colleagues, I think mainly in India, about what I think is a very important topic. I'll give away my main point right away, which is while I think the COVID crisis has significant implications for higher education around the world, it's not going to cause a major revolution or even maybe in most areas major transformation. Yes, it's important, but I think we're going to go back to a normal, maybe close to the old normal than a new one in the future. So that's the main point. I also want to ask our audience if to do some thinking. That is, we have time at the end of this conversation for a Q&A, as we always do, but I would like to make this more of an A than a Q. That is, I'm going to be speaking about what I think are some of the implications and non-implications, and I would like the audience to think about what does this mean for you, especially in India? How do you think COVID is going to impact your institutions and the broader system there? Because my comments are based on kind of a broad global perspective on the matter. So with that introduction and with a very serious request from me for you guys to do some thinking on your own, let me provide briefly what I think are some of the key aspects. I think that the fundamental reality of our industry is going to be pretty much the same. Most students and professors will be engaged in face-to-face instruction. The current basic structure of academic institutions and systems will not be altered. The overall financial situation of higher education, while I think in some areas, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, will be problematical for a short time, I think overall the system will be pretty much the same. I think that the use of information technology, distance education, online degrees, and so on, which were already growing and quite important, although peripheral to the broader system, will grow in importance with the lessons that we've learned from COVID. And I think that it's really one of the important implications, and I think positive implications of the crisis, is that globally we've improved tremendously the technology of IT and distance education. It works better than it used to. Just as important, the academic community, and especially the faculty members, and even professors who might be almost as old as I am, have had to adjust to the new reality and have been dragged, some of us kicking and screaming, into the age of distance instruction. So we've gotten, from all points of view, much better at it. Academic institutions have also figured out how to integrate distance into the broader curriculum, and have, in many parts of the world, spent significant amounts of money and expertise on developing this. So I think IT will be more important. There'll be some more degree offerings through distance only. I think there'll be a lot more hybrid, that is, students who are learning and professors who are teaching using both direct and distance methodologies and approaches. So I think that's important. IT and distance will still be somewhat peripheral, I think, to the entire academic enterprise. In other words, it's not going to take over. And I think that there are a number of for-profit companies and so on that are getting into this space with a lot of funding from venture capital and so on. And I think they will see less immediate success than they think, but who knows? As I said, the technical aspects and our thinking about how the curriculum is going to be developed using IT, I think has been quite important. And this is the same is true in other areas of modern society. Just one example is telemedicine, which prior to COVID was really, at least in the United States, not accepted by most people, either the medical people or the patients. And now it is. And the insurance companies, very importantly, have agreed to provide payment for telemedicine. So COVID has infused in our societies significantly more understanding of the use of this kind of technology. I think the impact of the COVID crisis will be less on the top tier research intensive universities than on other parts of the academic system. Indeed, in all countries, in all contexts, higher education is not a unified enterprise. It's highly differentiated, different kinds of institutions, different patterns of funding, different ownership patterns, and so on. And I think this will affect the COVID crisis. Indeed, the research universities, we've seen in the United States and also in Europe, that they have not suffered any enrollment declines. Indeed, they have done very well in terms of the students who are coming. Some analysts were worrying early in the COVID period that there would be severe drop-offs throughout the academic system. And what we have seen is that those declines in enrollment and in new applications from students are very much differentiated by the parts of the system. So, you know, in so many ways, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that is the case for higher education. And we can see it clearly in the United States as an example. Our community college, our two-year mainly vocational system, has suffered significant a downturn in enrollments. And I think this is really unfortunate for many reasons, because the community colleges are the entry point for first generation students and students from minority groups and so on. And to see them suffering enrollment declines is definitely not a good thing. Some parts of the private higher education sector in the United States, the less prestigious privates, are in deep trouble. Some have gone out of business. I think more of them will not survive COVID. And these trends were there prior to COVID, but I think have been exacerbated by the current situation. One aspect that will help the research universities, and this is true in the United States, and it's true to a lesser extent in the UK and on the European continent, and that is the governments have been putting in significant new research funds. In the US, it's something like $200 billion, which is a part of the COVID relief legislation, which passed the Senate and is being distributed now, of additional research funding, much of it in health sciences and but also in general for higher education. And there are similar boosts, not so dramatic, in other parts of the world. So again, most of that funding is going to go to the research university sector. So I think there's going to be increased inequality in higher education overall. And I've mentioned this. Students from lower socioeconomic groups and minorities who have greater problems accessing technology have dropped out in bigger numbers. And we've seen, as I mentioned already, that applications for next year for the community colleges are down. So in some parts, even in the United States, access to the internet is inadequate, or in some cases even non-existent. And I know that's very much the case in India. And we're seeing the implications of the divisions between rich and poor in our societies. And the Biden administration in America, and to some extent the EU, have understood this and are trying to expand internet access and other kinds of financial assistance. Let me spend a few minutes on internationalization and international mobility and what the COVID crisis has meant and not meant for that. Clearly, global mobility of students, which is about 6 million students are studying overseas in outside their own countries, that has declined because of COVID. Students, overseas students, to some extent, are accessing higher education through distance education because they can't get to the campus. There have been a number of studies that have shown that both domestic students and overseas students very much want to study on campus. That's the real education. And the overseas students and domestics have also been prevented from doing that. So these are problems. My own view is that face-to-face international mobility will slowly increase. It will slowly go back to normal, but it probably will not grow at the rate that it was anywhere in the world prior to COVID. And again, this trend was there even before the COVID crisis. That is, the growth pattern of international mobility was slightly down. I think that internationalization is going to make better use and more use of IT. And I think that's a good thing. And when we talk about internationalization at home, and what we mean by that is the effort to provide the very large majority of students who don't have an opportunity to travel overseas for an experience, either as part of a domestic degree program or to study completely overseas. We need to internationalize their experience, and that's a big discussion in the United States and in some other countries, trying to make internationalization relevant for domestic home students. I think for India, this will have a significant impact. My own view is that India is probably not going to attract big numbers of students from what we call the global north for degree studies, even in best of circumstances. India already attracts a relatively small number of students from Africa and from South Asia. And I think that will continue, and that's a good thing, both for India and for the other countries. But I think India needs to think about how to provide non-degree programs, taking advantage of what is going to be an increased interest in knowledge about India, the world's a growing economy in the world, a very major country, and one which will be more important politically, economically, socially going forward. And I think India needs to be both realistic and innovative in trying to think through how it can develop internationalization for itself. And again, I think that in this kind of thinking, we don't really need to focus on the COVID crisis. Hopefully, it will be mitigated. It will maybe be at an end. I think, frankly speaking, the medical experts tell us it's going to be, some aspects are going to be with us for a long time, but it will be manageable. And I think higher education is going to adjust reasonably well to the crisis and to the future. And with that, I'm going to conclude. I hope very much to have your views about how you think your country and maybe other countries too are going to adjust to the situation. I don't mean to push our distinguished Vice Chancellor uh, uh, in any way, but it would be very interesting to have his view, both as a commentator and as a student of global higher education, and as the head of one of India's definitely leading and most innovative universities. Jindal, by the way, not to give you a shout out too much, but Jindal is increasingly known around the world and is one of the relatively small number of new private universities in India, which I think are really doing a very, very good job of improving thinking about higher education and offering higher education on the subcontinent. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking. And I really look forward to hearing your reactions to what I've had to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, for a very sobering tour de force on the future of higher education post-COVID. And I think it's a very sobering reflections at a time when there are wild predictions of what COVID-19 could have done to higher education and the future of universities. I will be definitely keen to respond to some of the points that you mentioned, but I'm going to first request Professor Stephen Marks to deliver his presidential address, and then we will have a discussion, both my own views and reflections on some of the issues that you've raised, but also take up some questions from the audience as well. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very, very much, Raj. This event is billed as a platform for universities worldwide to come together to help shape the universities of the future. And I think it is hard to conceive of a greater authority to tell us what this all means than what you've just heard from Philip Altbach. He has more experience than any of us in this area and in seeing what is happening, and his understanding of what the future has in store for us is, I think, central to where we go from here. I would like to add some reflections on this topic by drawing upon the Human Development Report 2020, which is entitled The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, as we know, is described as just as the Earth has entered a geological period in which humanity is the dominant force shaping the planet, so humanity has entered a historical period in which the dominant risks to its survival come from humanity itself. So with this in mind, I'd like to make three observations, which I hope capture in a way that will be, I hope, overlapping and reinforcing what Philip said about less than meets the eye, which I understand to be a reality check on what the pandemic has not changed, but that higher education can address with more purpose than ever. The first is what I call behavioral tipping points in social norms. UN Secretary General Guterres reported on the key findings of a global conversation or survey of over 1 million people from all over the world on the future we want. The first of these findings, which he said align with the main topics of the Human Development Report, to which I alluded, provides some ground for optimism for the future. Quote, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the immediate priority of most respondents everywhere is improved access to basic services, healthcare, safe water and sanitation, and education. This was right at the top of the survey of 1 million people. Chapter 4 of that report is on empowering people unleashing transformation, which emphasizes the importance of education and identifies ways in which catalytic action can ripple across society, helping to shift norms and empower people to act on their values. The essential message here is that education, including higher education, has more than an instrumental role. Its purpose is transformative through exposure to broad human values and the promotion of critical thinking to make for politically aware and active people. So the important insight regarding the Anthropocene is that social norms are known to be persistent and hard to change. Survival through economic development and political regimes that these social norms survive through political regimes. But when they change, it can happen quickly, usually when new public information becomes available, as during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question that Philip raised, and that I agree with, is that there may be a possible behavioral turning point for some people when there are enough people to have strong attitudes against an existing social norm or towards a new one that can lead to norm change. The tough question is, and I think Philip would answer in the negative, and so would I, do we have enough through post-COVID to expect a new understanding? It has been said that education is essential in helping this along. I'd like to link this concept of tipping points in social norms and the role of education to the concept of human development. As we know, it derives from the thinking of Amartya Sen and drives the Human Development Report. But I want to mention it for a reason that goes beyond our theme of less than meets the eye. Raj Kumar, the Vice Chancellor of the host university for this conference, has announced the launch in 1 year's time of the Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development. And I'm honored to assist him in this endeavor because human development adds a dimension to learning, especially in areas such as public health, that can make a difference post-COVID. So my first observation on the post-COVID realities for higher education is that the potential of a tipping point is enhanced, and a human development perspective can help students find the values and analytical framework for a new perspective as citizens of their professional careers. That literally, and that's the message of this Human Development Report, can save the planet. Now, my second observation relates to the mention in the conference description of the pivotal challenge of reimagining the role of universities and how technological advancements, pedagogical and disciplinary innovations, academic research, combined with globalization and deeper societal engagement, are now changing the very way higher educational institutions function. Session 8 of this conference is called A Paradigm Shift, and session 20 will address virtual sustainability and the digital divide. Well, is that true? And I think Philip has also given us a sobering reflection on the extent to which, in spite of some valuable improvements, things are not likely to be transformed. Yes, campuses have closed and visas have been canceled and instruction is provided online, and this will provide some innovations in teaching, but not a fundamental transformation. So I fear the same will be true for the universities of the future. That is, the return to normal will only involve a superficial change. Perhaps those panels that I alluded to a moment ago and other panels here will prove us wrong. We will see. My third point is that I have higher expectations about the extent to which the post-COVID global realities will reflect greater diversity. Here's another transformative issue. Yes, there are a lot of white male speakers at this conference, all distinguished leaders in higher education. They have played an extraordinary role in guiding the best universities in the world, and they would be the first to agree that more diverse leadership in higher education would enhance quality. A few years ago, Higher Public Ed wrote, despite years of talk about increasing diversity, chatter about interest in hiring from outside academe, and buzz about coming wave of retirements, college and university professors and presidents in recent times have looked very much like they did years before. They still tended to be aging white men, and they keep getting older. Well, session 1 of this conference was on the road to equity, university support systems to promote diversity and inclusion in higher education, and 2 special dialogues addressed gender diversity. The global mobilization for Blacks, Indigenous peoples, Dalits, and so many other peoples from diverse ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds is making a difference already. For example, frontline healthcare workers were studied by practitioners focusing on universal health coverage, and they found that education plays a critical role in bringing people of diverse backgrounds to make a difference post-COVID. So my conclusion is, and taking these 3 points, that if we look at what the post-COVID future reality in higher education will look like, there is a potential for contributing to the tipping point to change social norms regarding the Anthropocene. This, as understood in the deep sense of understanding the Anthropocene, and I would urge you all to take a look at that Human Development Report 2020, is genuinely an existential challenge. The second point is the creative adapting of technologies to new learning environments. And Philip Altbach was very brilliant, I think, in saying what we can and cannot expect from this. And the third, where I'm a bit more optimistic, is enhancing diversity. Those are the 3 dimensions of the post-COVID global realities that strike me as less than meets the eye, but pose a genuine challenge for higher education to adapt and adjust in ways that can fulfill the ultimate role of higher education for the future. Thank you very much, and I turn the floor back over to the Vice Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Steve, for a very short and succinct set of reflections on the theme of the conference, but also some of the important points that Philip had made. We have already received several questions, and I will get back to it shortly. But before I do that, I want to briefly respond to some of the issues that Philip had raised. So one of the things that what I want to do is to kind of respond it in 2 ways. In terms of the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis in India, as far as higher education sector is concerned, I've identified few things that will change and a few things that will not change. But before I do that, I must say that I have been quite, to a large extent, been inspired by the National Education Policy 2020. Rarely in recent times, I have seen a governmental policy of this kind, particularly in the education sector, which has received so much of positive feedback across the education community, but more importantly, a higher level of political consensus has been arrived at, and now we will have to see how this will be implemented. Be that as it may, that in itself has created a number of, let's say, cause for optimism in the larger context of Indian higher education. Now, let me say what will change. Well, first of all, I think one of the things that COVID-19 has done is, to a large extent, it has created both individual and institutional resilience across the Indian education sector, not only limited to higher education and universities. Wherever possible, depending upon the socio-economic context of the institution, the kind of efforts that educators have put together to ensure that the learning is not disrupted, notwithstanding the fact that a large number of Indian households may not have the 3 most important required elements of having a reasonable access to education, which is a reasonable uninterrupted electricity and equipment, and of course, Wi-Fi access. Even with those challenges, the COVID-19 crisis has created a huge sense of resilience that has been demonstrated. The second thing that will change, I believe, is the importance towards research and innovation for increasing access to education. This is an area where, as Philip rightly mentioned, there have been efforts even before COVID-19, but COVID-19 crisis has accelerated the public policy and priorities of the government to pay attention to access to education. The third, which I think is quite important in the Indian context, is that it has accelerated regulatory reforms for innovation to empower universities, including significant investments in creating IT, information technology-based infrastructure for promoting digital learning. This has become part of the priority of the government, and they are also created an enabling environment in which things that were considered outside the framework of those regulatory aspects have become much more open. Now, the fourth thing which we saw completely, I would say, a tectonic shift that has happened during the COVID-19 crisis is a strong attention that has been given to the promotion of online degrees for professional courses. And I expect that postgraduate education and professional education to have a stronger online degrees accepted both in India, from Indian institutions and abroad. Although I must say that this is going to be to a large extent limited in non-STEM and non-medicine based disciplines. And the fifth thing that I believe will change is that this particular crisis has the potential to empower Indian higher education institutions and in a way that they can attract many more Indian students to actually prefer to stay in India, study in India, at least for undergraduate education, provided we are able to build and develop and nurture high quality higher education institutions. These are the 5 things that I believe will change, and there is cause for optimism. Now, what will not change is also equally important. I don't believe, and I share the views expressed by both Steve and Philip here, the importance and the relevance of brick and mortar campuses, especially for undergraduate education, is not going to change, while the current crisis has given emphasis on other ways by which education could be given. But we will definitely go back to the ways by which brick and mortar campuses remain relevant. What also will not change, and although the current crisis has interrupted that process, international opportunities, internationalization of higher education, all of that will also come back. The third is partnerships and collaborations in between institutions from India, in India to other institutions around the world will also not change and will be promoted as well. So in conclusion, all I want to say is that I do believe that fundamentally the higher education sector and the future of universities are not going to be seeing a revolution post-COVID, but some of the consequences of COVID-19 has the potential for countries like India and education institutions in India to reimagine and hopefully seek some of the more urgent and immediate transformations that are required to benchmark Indian higher education institutions with its global counterparts. That's my response to Philip's fantastic presentation. Let me quickly get to those questions that have come about. So, Philip, I'll have you respond to some of my reflections if you deem it appropriate. But let me quickly go into the questions that have come. One of the questions is another person who has asked this question is focusing on technology allowing customization, yet contextualizing educational experience for students. It's not simply about customization. And the question is, what are the ways of humanizing digital platforms for students? Philip, that's for you.
I'm sorry, it's for me because I'm not a tech guy, and so I don't really have a good answer to that question, other than to say two things. One is it's important, and the other is it's not easy. And I think one of the things we've learned is that from an instructor's point of view, providing effective and impactful distance instruction for students is not so easy. And it requires actual contact with the student and so on. And we've both technologically and I think mentally have learned that it's not easy to implement. But I agree with the questioner's approach And if I had a good answer to that deep question, I would probably be winning a Nobel Prize next time.
Thank you very much, Philip. Philip, of course, I think people know about your research work. This question is probably from somebody who knows your own views on this matter. The question is, how can the ranking agencies think about revising their international and national ranking parameters after the pandemic? In a way, the question is that whether they will consider that as well. Does pandemic have any implications for international rankings of universities?
Yeah, great question. I've said for a long time, we should in general pay less attention to the rankings. And I think India really needs to pay a little less attention to the rankings. I'll give you a small example from the national economic policy that Raj has mentioned, and that is India is asking that when Indian institutions want to link up with a foreign institution, it has to be in the top 200 of the rankings, and even in some cases in the top 100. Ladies and gentlemen, that's stupid. Forget about it. First of all, those institutions are maybe not going to be so interested. And secondly, there are lots of institutions, foreign institutions, that are not in the top 200, which in specialized areas are really, really good, or are too small, or whatever. I give you an example of my own employer, Boston College, which is ranked 34 or 32, something like that in the US rankings, but doesn't appear internationally because we don't have a medical school and we don't have engineering. Yet we're highly selective institution. So we need to pay less attention to the rankings. To the direct question that was raised, will COVID make a difference in how the rankers do their methodology? Not really. The rankers have tried, in my view, with very, very limited success, to add a range of aspects to the rankings, such as sustainable development, such as community involvement, and so on. All very important things, but in terms of measuring institutions across countries, impossible to measure. So they figure out ways of doing it which are, in my view, not realistic and not useful. The rankers, two of the three main international rankings, of course, are commercial enterprises, have a desire to keep the industry going, and they'll do anything they can, realistic or not, to keep it going. Well, that's a bit too much. I do tend to foam at the mouth a little bit about the rankings, so maybe of interest to you.
Thank you, Philip. Well, we should have a separate discussion on that in any case. There's another very interesting question. Maybe, Steve, you should answer this. This question is about the pandemic has exposed how embedded fundamental disparities are between rich and poor, elite and non-elite education institutions, even in the digital world. How can one bridge this gap in the context of post-COVID global realities? Of course, Steve, you know that UNESCO reports has come about saying that a billion plus children around the world have been deprived of the opportunity to be educated. Across the developing world, the problem is significant. So this person has asked a question on that. Please, Steve.
It's a massive issue, and you're right to cite the data provided by UNESCO, and the World Bank has also looked at the impact on education and the increased lack of access to education. Access to education has always been fundamental. The problem has been exacerbated. And frankly, it takes a massive influx of resources. Governments in countries that have been severely impacted in a variety of ways by the pandemic and by other economic and climatic factors, lack the resources to be able to get those kids back in school. It's going to take billions and billions and billions of dollars. And there are many agencies that are placing a priority on that. Their resources need to be multiplied by a factor of 10. So that's part of it. It needs to be, the resources have to be made available. And the second one is the awareness of what the questioner was alluding to, of the magnitude of the problem, needs to have political impact. There need to be political decision makers who will attach a high enough priority to this so that those resources will be allocated. But I completely agree, the disparities are reflected in education, and it hits very hard on primary and secondary education as well. And one of this was alluded to in another panel, I think Philip may have alluded to it, is the role of vocational and technical education in this regard. And there needs to be rethought in ways that can contribute to making people who normally don't have access to education become productive members of society by getting at least a degree of vocational and technical education so that they can have a remunerative job. But the larger question is resources and political will.
Yeah. If I can make one
Please, Philip.
Somewhat related comment. I agree with everything that Stephen has said. India, I think, has been particularly weak in the vocational education, the sort of post-school vocational education area since the beginning. And one of the things that the National Economic Policy, at least so far as I have read it, it doesn't deal with all that much. I mean, you can't ask them to deal with everything, is that aspect. And I think one of the successful parts of American approaches to vocational education is the fact that it's integrated into the system. That is, you can go to a 2-year open access community college, and if you want, you can transfer up. And that's pretty unusual. And my point here just is, I think India needs to think about how the vocational education system fits into the broader context of Indian higher education. And we all agree it's of central importance. And we all agree it's been, kind of neglected in many countries, but particularly in India.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Philip and Steve, for that. It's absolutely one of the things that I have always inspired by the experience of both United States and also China is the role and evolution of community colleges across, these countries. Unfortunately, there is a lot of pejorativeness associated with vocational education, and there is a lot of reluctance and hesitance on the part of people to actually engage in those type of institutions. And part of the problem also is that even the community colleges, at least the ones I visited, they are truly of world-class standards in the US. And I do believe that we need to create such institutional architecture, even when we are promoting vocational education, because it shouldn't be seen to be a mediocre type of a model where those who can't get into higher education institutions in the form of degree awarding in STEM disciplines or other humanities and social sciences, those who pretty much have failed in entering into regular universities end up going to those type of places. That is an attitudinal shift that India has to undergo, and we still have a long way to go there. All right, we have a few minutes left. So Philip, there's another very interesting question. Before the COVID-19 crisis, we were worried about artificial intelligence changing the ways we work. Today, a virus has changed our work life. As we see more and more companies moving towards remote working, what additional skills do you believe should be inculcated in our curriculum to adapt to the jobs of the next decade?
Yeah, again, the Vice Chancellor is laughing because he knows if I can answer that question effectively, I get a second Nobel Prize.
I know.
What can I say? It's important. And I think that there are efforts in a number of ways to try to do that, to try to provide training. And I say training in a bit more than education, to the skills necessary to function in the high-tech industries. Increasingly, there are these boot camps, and there are various kinds of not degrees, but certificates which are offered often by, unfortunately, I think, for-profit private companies in these areas. Some of the big tech companies, Google and others, offer such things. We need to think more about it. And maybe the only constructive point I can make is that our industry, higher education, needs to think more clearly how we can better integrate these. Because the questioner raises a very important question. And it's certainly the case that our traditional universities have really not grappled with the complications of these issues, and they need to. And what's the link between this kind of technical training and real education? And I don't have a good answer to that, but it's part of a thinking that we all need to do.
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, Steve, it is no secret that you have been appointed as the Dean Designate of the future to be established Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development. So this question is about to what extent universities can play a role in appreciating the global pandemic that we have experienced, and then to provide leadership for and preparedness for the future of dealing with similar crises of the magnitude that we have seen. I think it is only fair to say that the unprecedented nature of the crisis that we have witnessed, in which more than the entire disruption and devastation that we have seen of both society and economy and education and all sectors, do you think this has the opportunity for societies led by universities to better prepare itself when it comes to issues surrounding public health and human development? And if yes, what should universities do about it?
There's a premise, if I understood correctly, that I would question. The concept of preparedness has been built into higher education, and especially public health education, and government institutions for many, many, many decades. There was an inexcusable failure to apply the institutional preparedness to ramp it up rapidly enough, but the groundwork was laid. That's what public health was born. Public health was born in response to the spread of disease and the responsibility of the state to develop institutions to discover the source of those diseases and respond to them, and determine the sources of them. So this has always been part of public health. And again, I'll repeat, is actually the founding of public health. What is interesting is that public health has expanded, and you're alluding now to what we are going to try to do at the Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development, which is to integrate a broader societal set of objectives into the response to public health. So yes, of course, you do need pandemic preparedness. You do need to understand the molecular biology involved in spread of pandemics. You do need to understand the public health governance issues that can be more responsive to a crisis when it occurs. And those are the technical aspects that are to be expected from a school of public health, and they need to be ramped up. And you need people adequately trained to deal with that. not only at the higher levels, because I'm thinking now of the challenges facing India, but at the community level and the district level. But the broader challenge here is to put that in a context of the response, which is why I alluded to the recent Human Development Report that had a focus on education in the context of preparing people all over the world to respond to the broad range of crises. Pandemics are part of it. Pandemics are going to increase with the what we call the climate crisis or the Anthropocene and so on. So it's useful and valuable and necessary to integrate public health education into that broader understanding of how we as a species can respond to the destruction of the planet and the capacity of humans to survive in this planet. So yes, it means all the technical aspects of preparing for the next pandemic, and it will come. And also a broader range of understanding of how human development is the ultimate objective of achieving an effective public health system.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that. That's a very comprehensive response to the question. Philip, now we are coming to the end of it. There's a last question for you. This is about the evolution of online education through edtech platforms. There was a point of time, not so in the distant past, organizations such as Coursera and in the Indian context, Bagnoud and others have been offering this education, and it was to some extent met with a certain degree of skepticism. Today, the COVID-19 crisis has created fantastic opportunities for people to embrace this form of online education and are moving across different levels of credentials as well as degree awarding type of models. In fact, both these organizations have collaborated with many Indian universities, and by way of full disclosure, OP Jindal Global University is working with both Coursera and Bagnoud to offer online degree programs. So my question to you is that to what extent universities need to be conscious of these type of new realities as we look at the future?
Yes. First of all, let me mention what I think is kind of a sad story. We've noticed in the US, probably it hasn't, India has more important things to think about, that the main not-for-profit distance education provider, edX, which was a combination of Harvard and MIT, which has been going on for almost a decade, has just been sold by Harvard and MIT to Coursera for $180 million, not small money, which to me is horrible news because it takes the main not-for-profit provider and sells it to a for-profit provider. And there's been some discussion on both sides about this issue. But to answer the question, yes, it is, as I said in my presentation, I do not think that the, COVID is going to revolutionize the way degrees are offered, the way instruction is given, and so on overall. But these alternative providers, if I can put it that way, particularly the good ones, and also innovative ones that are offering not degrees, but certificates and badges and things like that, will be, I think, a more important part of the total system. And to me, the lesson simply is that we in the traditional higher education sector, and Jindal is already doing this, and many other universities too, we need to pay attention to these. We need to be careful in choosing appropriate partners. We need to figure out how these efforts can be integrated in a constructive way into our traditional programs. We need to provide good advice to our students as to how to take advantage and so on, because the future is, as we've all said, on campus, but the future is also a bit hybrid. So these providers, and we can't do it all ourselves. It's beyond even Harvard and MIT. And what they said is it just got too big and too complicated, and it was sort of beyond them. And if it's beyond them, it's beyond most of us.
Well, thank you very much, Philip and Steve. What a fascinating discussion that we've had. I deeply appreciate, Philip, for you to have taken time from your precious schedule and not only to deliver a fantastic and inspiring keynote address, but also to have patiently answered so many questions and shared your views and perspectives. Thank you very much, Steve, for your presence here. Once again, I am grateful to you for your time and your presence. So the first day's proceedings of the World University Summit has just ended. It is 11:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. We will be back again at 7:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time for the second day's proceedings for the 9th thematic session on rising to the challenge, transformative leadership in times of uncertainty. We will have with us Professor Dr. David Lassner, President of the University of Hawaii in the United States of America, Professor Dr. Barney Glover, Vice Chancellor and President of the Western Sydney University, Professor Dr. Uttam Gauli, President of the Star Scholars Network at the US, Professor Dr. Adam Shoemaker, Vice Chancellor and President of the Victoria University in Australia. And this session will be moderated by my own colleague, Professor Dr. Kalyani Unkule, Director and Head of the Office of Alumni Relations at OPTL Global University. Till then, stay safe, and we will see you again tomorrow. Thank you very much, Philip and Steve, for your time.